In the spring of 1985, when most farmers in Hancock County, Illinois, were lined up at the bank trying to figure out how to make their next payment, Ray Jensen was doing something nobody understood. He was buying used equipment at rock-bottom prices while his neighbors called him crazy. It was a Tuesday morning in late March when Ray first heard people talking about him at the Farmers' Co-op in Nauvoo. He'd come in to pick up some hydraulic fluid and a set of plow points. The place smelled like it always did, a mix of diesel fuel, seed treatment chemicals, and coffee from the pot that had been sitting since 6 that morning. 3 farmers were standing by the counter, waiting for their orders. Ray recognized them all. Jim Peterson, who farmed 800 acres north of town, Mark Sullivan, 100 acres east toward Hamilton, and Bob Crawford, who'd expanded to 1,600 acres in 1980 by taking on a massive loan to buy his neighbor's place. They stopped talking when Ray walked in, which told him everything. They'd been talking about him. Ray was 52 years old that year. He'd been farming the same 640 acres outside Nauvoo since 1958, 27 years of working the same ground, learning every field, every low spot that held water, every rise that dried out fast in spring. The land had been in his family since his father, Walter Jensen, had bought it during the Depression for $18 an acre. Back when nobody wanted farmland because nobody had any money to buy it. Walter had worked in a grain elevator in Keokuk, Iowa, and had saved every penny he could through the 1930s. While other men drank away their troubles or gave up hope, Walter had kept a coffee can under his bed and put money in it every week. By 1937, he had enough to buy 640 acres of Hancock County bottomland from a bank that was desperate to unload foreclosed property. He paid cash. The whole thing was done in one afternoon. Walter had told Ray the story 100 times. "The banker couldn't believe I had the money," Walter would say, sitting on the porch in the evening. "He kept asking where I got it, like maybe I robbed somebody." I showed him the bills, counted them out right there on his desk, $11,120 in cash. He just shook his head and drew up the papers. That farm had been paid off the day Walter bought it, and it stayed that way. When Walter passed the farm to Ray in 1958, he'd made Ray promise one thing: never let the bank own this land. The minute you owe them money on the land itself, you've lost. You might still be farming, but you don't own it anymore. They do. Ray had kept that promise. The farm had been paid off since 1962, 3 years after he'd married his wife Linda and moved into the old farmhouse his father had built in 1940. No mortgage, no land debt, just property taxes every year and the cost of working the ground. But in 1985, Ray's neighbors thought he'd lost his mind. The farm crisis was in full swing, the worst agriculture had seen since the 1930s. Land values had collapsed from their 1981 peak. In Hancock County, ground that had sold for $3,200 an acre in 1980 was now worth $1,400 if you could find a buyer. The bubble had burst. Interest rates were still hovering around 14% after peaking at over 20% just a few years before. The Federal Reserve's war on inflation had worked, but it had killed rural America in the process. Grain prices were in the basement. Corn was selling for $2.10 a bushel at the Nauvoo elevator. Soybeans were at $5.25. These were prices that didn't cover the cost of seed and fertilizer, let alone equipment payments or land notes. Farmers were doing the math and realizing they were losing money on every bushel they sold. Every week, it seemed, another farm went up for auction. Ray went to most of them, not to gawk or gossip, but to buy equipment. While other farmers stood around in small groups, shaking their heads at the tragedy of it all, whispering about how the bank had been ruthless or how the family was moving to town or taking factory jobs, Ray would be examining tractors and planters with the careful eye of a mechanic. He'd check oil levels, look for leaks, run his hand along hydraulic hoses, feeling for cracks. He'd climb into the cab and check the hours on the meter. He'd get down on the ground and look at tires, checking for dry rot or uneven wear that might indicate alignment problems. And then he'd bid. Always used equipment, always older models, never anything new or even close to new. His neighbors noticed. At the grain elevator, at the farm supply store, at Martha's Cafe on Main Street in Nauvoo, where farmers gathered for coffee every morning at 6, people talked. "Ray Jensen bought another old tractor yesterday," Jim Peterson said one morning, sitting in his usual spot at the counter. He was drinking black coffee and eating a cinnamon roll, though his doctor had told him to cut back on sugar. A 72 International 1066. Things got over 12,000 hours on it. Can you believe that? Bob Crawford was sitting 2 stools down. He had dark circles under his eyes. He hadn't been sleeping well. His loan payment was due in 2 weeks and he was short. "What's he thinking?" Bob said, stirring sugar into his coffee. "Doesn't he know we're in a crisis? Nobody's buying equipment right now. You hold on to your cash, wait for things to stabilize. Buying equipment now is like buying a ticket on the Titanic after it hit the iceberg." Mark Sullivan nodded in agreement. He was younger than the other two, only 34, but he looked older. The stress of the past 3 years had aged him. "I heard he paid $3,800 for that 1066 in cash. Just pulled out the money right there at the auction." "Where's he getting the cash?" Jim wondered. "I thought he just farmed 640 acres. That's not enough to be saving that kind of money, not in this market." Nobody had an answer. The truth was simpler than they imagined, but it would have been hard for them to accept. Ray saved money because he didn't spend money. His newest tractor before this buying spree had been a 1973 International 1466 he'd bought used in 1977. He'd been running that same lineup of equipment for 8 years. No payments, no debt, just maintenance and repairs, which he did himself. But Ray wasn't buying equipment because he wanted new toys or because he enjoyed shopping at auctions. He was buying it because it was cheap, it was paid for with cash he'd saved, and most importantly, he could fix it himself with his own 2 hands. See, Ray had grown up in a different era, a harder time when self-reliance wasn't optional. He'd learned farming from his father in the 1940s and 50s, when you didn't call a dealer service department every time something broke down in the field. You fixed it yourself. You had to. The nearest international harvester mechanic was in Fort Madison, 32 miles away, and even if you could convince him to drive out to your farm, you couldn't afford his labor rates. $50 an hour in the 1950s might as well have been $500. So Ray's father, Walter, had taught him how to weld when he was 12 years old, how to set up a cutting torch and not blow himself up, how to rebuild an engine, starting with the old Farmall H they'd bought in 1946, how to fabricate parts when you couldn't buy them, or when buying them meant waiting 3 weeks for a part to come in from Chicago. Walter had bought a lathe at an auction in 1952, an old South Bend that had come out of a machine shop in Burlington. He taught Ray how to use it, how to turn down a shaft, how to cut threads, how to make a bushing. These were skills most farmers didn't have anymore. But Walter remembered the Depression, remembered when you either fixed things yourself or you went without. Ray had built on that foundation. His shop behind the barn was better equipped than some dealer service departments. He had that old South Bend lathe, still working 70 years after it was built. He had a Bridgeport milling machine he'd bought at an estate sale in 1976, a Lincoln 225-amp stick welder, a Miller wire feed welder for sheet metal work, a hydraulic press for bearings and bushings, a complete set of machinist tools, micrometers and calipers and dial indicators. He could make gaskets from scratch using gasket paper and a ball-peen hammer. He could bore out a cylinder that had been scored and fit new sleeves. He could rebuild a transmission with nothing but a factory service manual and patience, laying out every gear and shaft on his workbench, cleaning each piece, measuring everything, replacing what was worn. This wasn't just a hobby, this was survival. Every repair he did himself was money he didn't pay to a dealer. Every part he fabricated was money he kept in his pocket. Over the course of a year, the savings added up to thousands of dollars. Over the course of a decade, tens of thousands. The equipment he was buying at these crisis auctions in 1985, it wasn't junk being hauled away for scrap. It was good iron that had been maintained by farmers who'd cared about their machinery, but who'd gotten caught in the debt trap when land values fell and grain prices collapsed. These were men who'd believed the agriculture economists and the government officials who'd told them to get big or get out, to expand and modernize and leverage their equity while they had it. A 1972 International 1066 with high hours but a solid engine that just needed valve work. A 1968 John Deere 4020 that needed a clutch replaced, a job Ray could do in a weekend. A 1974 Case 970 that had a hydraulic leak from a cracked fitting. A $5 part and 30 minutes of work. These were tractors that would work for another 20 years, another 30 years if you took care of them. The technology hadn't changed that much. A diesel engine was a diesel engine. A hydraulic pump was a hydraulic pump. You kept the oil clean, kept the filters fresh, greased the fittings, and the machine would outlast you. And Ray was paying pennies on the dollar because everyone else was terrified. The other farmers at these auctions weren't buying, they were selling, or they were there to watch, to see their neighbor's life being auctioned off, piece by piece, and to think, thank God it's not me, yet. At one auction in late April of 1985, on a grey Saturday morning with rain threatening, Ray bought a complete line of field equipment from a farmer named Tom Hendricks. The auction was being held at Tom's farm, 6 miles east of Nauvoo on County Road 2300. Ray had known Tom for 15 years. They'd served together on the County Farm Bureau Board. Their kids had been in 4-H together. Tom had farmed 1 to 200 acres, a good-sized operation. He'd inherited 600 acres from his father in 1975 and had bought another 600 acres in 1979, right at the peak of the market. He'd paid $2,900 an acre for that second 600, taking out a loan for the full amount, $1,240,000 at 11.5% interest. The loan officer at First National Bank in Carthage had encouraged him. Land values are going up 10–15% a year, the banker had said. This is an investment that'll pay for itself. In 5 years, that ground will be worth $4,000 an acre. You'll have equity you can borrow against. But land values hadn't gone up. They'd collapsed. By 1985, that 600 acres Tom had paid $1.7 million for was worth maybe $900,000 if he could find a buyer. He was underwater by $840,000, and that didn't count the interest he'd been paying. On top of that, Tom had bought new equipment in 1980 to work his expanded operation, 2 International 1086 tractors at $28,000 each. A 6-row International 800 cycloplanter for $6,200, a field cultivator for $2,800, a grain cart for $4,100. He'd financed it all through the dealer, another $75,000 in debt. For a couple of years it had worked. 1980 and 1981 had been good years. Corn hit $3.50 a bushel. Soybeans touched $9. Tom was making his payments, building equity, or so he thought. Then 1982 hit. Corn dropped to $2.20. By 1984, it was under $2.10. Tom's gross income fell by 40%, while his debt payments stayed exactly the same. He started missing payments, first the equipment loan, then the land loan. By early 1985, the bank had called both notes due. Tom couldn't pay. Foreclosure was the only option. Now, on this grey April morning, everything Tom had worked for was being sold at auction. About 80 people had shown up, some to buy, most just to watch. The auctioneer was Dale Warner from Hamilton, a professional who did farm auctions all over western Illinois. He'd done 12 foreclosure auctions already that year. This was number 13. Tom and his wife Marie stood off to the side near their truck. Marie had been crying. Her eyes were red and swollen. Tom's face was blank, like he'd run out of emotions. Their 3 kids, teenagers, sat in the truck cab. They didn't want to watch. The auction started with small items. Hand tools, shop equipment, some household items Marie had agreed to sell. Then they moved to the big equipment. Dale Warner started with the tractors. "All right, folks, we've got a pair of 1976 International 1086 here, both in good running condition. Low hours for their age. We'll sell them separately. Who'll start the bidding at $15,000? Nobody bid. Silence. $12,000? Dale asked. "Come on, folks. These are good tractors." More silence. Ray could feel the tension in the crowd. Nobody wanted to be the first to bid. It felt like profiting from tragedy. $10,000? Dale tried. Finally, a farmer from Hamilton raised his hand. $5,000, he called out. Dale grimaced but nodded. "I've got 5,000. Who'll give me 6? Ray raised his hand. 4,500. The other farmer looked annoyed but bid again. 5,000. The bidding went back and forth. Ray kept his bid small, incremental. He wasn't trying to steal the equipment, but he wasn't going to overpay either. Finally, at $4,500, the other farmer shook his head and dropped out. "Sold to Ray Jensen for $4,500, Dale announced. Tom Hendricks flinched at the price. That tractor had cost him $28,000 new 9 years ago. Now it was selling for $4,500. He'd made payments on that tractor for 9 years, probably paid $35,000 total with interest, and now it was gone for a sixth of what he'd paid. Ray bought the second 1086 for $4,700. He bought Tom's 6-row planter for $800. He bought the field cultivator for $350, the grain cart for $275. By the time the auction was done, Ray had spent $11,000 and had acquired a complete line of equipment that had cost Tom over $70,000 new. When the auction was over, Ray walked over to where Dale Warner was settling up with buyers. He pulled out an envelope from his jacket pocket. Inside was $11,000 in cash, mostly $100 bills. He always paid cash at auctions. No checks, no financing. Cash meant the deal was done right there. Dale counted the money, wrote up a receipt, and handed Ray the titles. "You got some good equipment today," Dale said. "Those 1086 are solid tractors." "I know," Ray said. He looked over at Tom Hendricks, still standing by his truck, and walked over. Tom saw him coming, and his jaw tightened. For a moment, Ray thought Tom might take a swing at him. But Tom just stood there, his hands in his pockets. "Tom," Ray said quietly. "You know the bank's going to come for you next, right?" Tom said. His voice was bitter, rough with anger and grief. "Nobody's safe in this. Doesn't matter if you buy cheap equipment or expensive equipment. The whole system's rigged against us. The government tells us to plant fence row to fence row. Then they cut off our export markets. The banks tell us to expand. Then they jack up the interest rates. We're just pawns." Ray counted out $4,500 bills, exact change for the tractor. He always paid cash at auctions. "I don't owe the bank anything, Tom," he said quietly. "Haven't for 23 years. Tom stared at him. "You're telling me you farm 640 acres with no debt? How's that possible?" "Never borrowed more than I could pay back in 1 year, Ray said, "and I only borrowed when I absolutely had to." Tom shook his head. "Must be nice. Some of us had to expand to survive." "Did you?" Ray asked. "Not mean, just honest." "Survive, I mean." Tom didn't have an answer for that. A month later, he and his wife moved to Cedar Rapids. Tom got a job at a John Deere plant. He never farmed again. Ray took that 1086 home, spent a weekend going through it, changed all the fluids, replaced the filters, adjusted the valves, greased every fitting. The tractor had been neglected in its final year as Tom had struggled to keep up. But the bones were good. Ray put that tractor to work and it ran flawlessly. His neighbors still thought he was crazy. They'd see him in town, driving his old 1979 Chevy pickup that had 180,000 miles on it, and they'd shake their heads. Ray Jensen, the guy who wouldn't spend money on anything new. But Ray didn't care what they thought. He'd learned a long time ago that farming wasn't about having the newest equipment or the most land. It was about staying solvent, about being there for the next season, about not letting debt bury you. Through 1985 and 1986, Ray kept buying equipment at auctions. He bought a 1975 John Deere 4430 for $6,200. He bought a 1970 International 856 for $2,100. He bought combines, grain wagons, tillage equipment, all of it used, all of it cheap, all of it functional. He also bought parts, entire tractors sometimes, just for parts. A burned-out 1066 with a seized engine but a good transmission. A wrecked 4020 with front-end damage but a perfect rear end. He'd strip these machines down in his shop, organize the parts, store them. When something broke on one of his working tractors, he'd have the part on hand. No waiting for the dealer, no overnight shipping charges. His shop became legendary, at least among the farmers who were still around. If you needed a part for an older International or John Deere, Ray probably had it. He'd sell parts to neighbors for cost, sometimes less. He wasn't trying to make money off other people's misfortune. He was trying to help them survive the same way he was surviving. By 1987, the crisis was starting to ease, but the damage was done. Hancock County had lost 30% of its farms. Good farmers, hard-working people gone. Their land bought up by the survivors or by corporate operations from out of state. Ray was still there, still farming his 640 acres, still running equipment that was 10, 15, 20 years old. And all of it paid for. In 1990, Ray did something that surprised everyone. He bought more land. The farm next to his, 320 acres, came up for sale. The farmer had died, and his kids didn't want to farm. Ray paid cash, $115,000 for 320 acres of prime bottomland. Nobody could understand where he'd gotten the money. The truth was simple. Ray had been saving for 32 years. Every year that he didn't have an equipment payment, that money went into the bank. Every year that he didn't buy new, that money went into the bank. Compound interest, steady savings, living below his means. By 1990, Ray had over $200,000 in the bank. He paid cash for that land and still had money left over. Now he was farming 960 acres. With the same old equipment, the newest tractor he owned was a 1985 International 5088 he'd bought at an auction in 1989 for $11,000. It had needed an engine overhaul, which Ray did himself over the winter. Cost him $12,400 in parts and about 80 hours of labor. When he was done, that tractor ran like new. Through the 1990s, Ray kept farming the way he always had. He'd buy used equipment when the price was right. He'd maintain it himself. He'd save his money. He didn't go to farm shows to drool over new equipment. He didn't read the glossy brochures about the latest technology. He just farmed. His son, David, came back to the farm in 1995 after college. David had gotten a degree in agricultural business from the University of Illinois. He'd learned about modern farming practices, about GPS and precision agriculture, about the latest in seed genetics and chemical applications. He looked at his father's operation and saw a museum, tractors from the 70s and 80s, a shop full of old iron, no computer monitoring systems, no yield maps, nothing fancy. "Dad," David said one evening as they were working on a 1978 John Deere 4440 in the shop, "don't you think it's time to upgrade? I mean, some of this stuff is older than I am." Ray was torquing down a head bolt, checking the spec in a grease-stained manual that was falling apart. "Does it work?" he asked. "Well, yeah, but does it do the job it's supposed to do?" "Yes, but technology has improved. New tractors are more efficient, more comfortable." "More expensive," Ray interrupted. He set down the torque wrench and looked at his son. "David, you see this farm? 960 acres, all paid for. Every piece of equipment you see paid for. I've got 150,000 in the bank. I make a good living, and I sleep at night because I don't owe anybody a dime. You want to give that up so you can sit in an air-conditioned cab?" David was quiet. He'd seen his friends from college, guys who'd gone back to their family farms. A lot of them were already stressed, already leveraged, already worried about making payments on equipment that cost more than a house. "I'm not saying don't move forward," Ray continued. "I'm saying don't move forward so fast you fall off the edge. This crisis we went through in the 80s, it's not the last one. There'll be another one. Maybe not as bad, maybe worse. But it'll come. And when it does, the guys who survive will be the guys who don't owe the bank their soul." David worked with his father for 5 more years, learning not just farming, but Ray's philosophy. How to fix things, how to make do, how to save, how to be patient. In 2000, Ray turned 70 and started stepping back. David took over more of the day-to-day operations, and yes, he bought some newer equipment. A 1998 John Deere 8400 tractor that he found at an estate sale. A 2002 Kinsey planter that a farmer was selling because he was downsizing. Always used, always paid for in cash, always fixable. The years rolled on. 2008 brought another crisis, this time in the broader economy. The housing market collapsed, banks failed. But grain prices actually went up as the dollar weakened. Corn hit $7 a bushel in 2012. Farmers who'd learned nothing from the 80s went on a buying spree. New equipment, more land, bigger operations. David watched it happen and remembered his father's words. He bought a little land, but only what he could pay for. He upgraded some equipment, but nothing crazy. He watched farmers he knew take on $1 million notes for combines and tractors. "It's different this time," they'd say. "Prices are high. We've got to expand while we can." But David knew it wasn't different. It's never different. By 2015, 30 years after Ray had started buying equipment at crisis auctions, grain prices were falling again. Corn was back under $4, soybeans under $9. Farmers who'd bought at the peak were hurting. Some were selling off equipment, some were selling land. David went to some of those auctions just like his father had. He bought a 2010 Case IH Magnum for $62,000. It had cost $185,000 new. He bought a 2012 planter for $18,000 that had cost $75,000 new. And the cycle continued. Ray Jensen passed away in 2018 at the age of 85. The funeral was packed. Farmers from all over Hancock County and beyond came to pay their respects. In the obituary, David wrote something simple. Ray Jensen farmed the same land for 60 years. He survived droughts, floods, blizzards, and financial crises. He did it by working hard, spending wisely, and never forgetting that the land doesn't care about your debt. It'll still be there long after the bank has foreclosed. He taught his son that the best equipment is the equipment that's paid for, and the best farm is the one you get to keep. Today, David farms that same 960 acres. He's added another 480 through careful purchases over the years, all paid in cash. He's got equipment ranging from the 1980s to the 2010s. None of it new, all of it functional, all of it paid for. In his shop, hanging on the wall above the main workbench, is a plaque. It's simple, just a piece of wood with rooted letters. It says the bank can't foreclose on what you own. Below it, in smaller letters, Ray Jensen, 1933-2018. He kept the farm. And that, in the end, is all that matters. Not the size of your operation, not the shine on your equipment, not the technology in your cab, just this. When the crisis comes, and it always comes, are you still there? Ray Jensen was. And because of him, his son still is too.